Lane Community College presents the Lane Peace and Democracy Conference.
And can you really succeed in war in the first place? You know, is there such a thing as winning a war?
We have now surpassed the military budget of the rest of the world combined.
The world can no longer entertain the delusion that the U.S. standard of living is possible for the entire planet.
I've tried the kumbaya, and we're all the same, and you know, that doesn't work anymore.
Just as war is too important to leave to the generals, civil liberties is too important to leave to the lawyers.
Women are standing up in these prestigious positions, and it's time.
We live in a society that is unequal, that is unjust, that is full of oppression and racism.
We need to commit to removal of all our forces.
And a favorite law enforcement tactic is to disturb a hive and then listen for the buzz.
You do not clear-cut forests to make toilet paper.
And then the riot police came in and told us, okay, everyone needs to stand in the sidewalk unless you want to get pepper sprayed or arrested.
And the Peace Center will be an important element in making a difference for ourselves, our community, and in time, the world.
And that all rights are equally important. The right not to be tortured or the right to vote is as important as the right to shelter and the right to food.
The biggest threat to humanity, it does come down to massive death.
Pepper spraying and shooting automatic rubber bullets into the crowd, so it sounded like machine gun, and everyone was pretty scared.
And our country has 1 out of every 100 of our people in jail.
The world economic system is destabilizing.
Terrorist acts are better treated as criminal acts with political implications rather than as an act of war.
The need to teach peace is obvious. The need to teach people other values besides war is obvious.
And if we leave it to a political party and a leader to decide whether to bring those troops home, they're not coming home.
Hello. So in this session, we're dealing with the big picture behind the Iraq occupation toward the foreign policy we need. We're worried that people working toward peace are focusing so much on Iraq that the bigger picture doesn't get put together. That's what led a set of us with progressive responses of Bruce Bowers, Carol Van Houten, and me, Dan Goldrich, to be working on this presentation. We rework it all the time, but not in the last we have in the last 5 minutes. So this is what we're presenting. A brief part on Iraq that, looking around, I think a lot of people will be as aware of, as informed about as we are. Then we want to say why we need to end it now and what we learned from Iraq and the global war on terror. And the big problem we're trying to get at and include in the picture is that we're being diverted from two huge issues that must be dealt with, and the time pressure is terrific: peak oil and global warming. And what is not on this slide, but that we want to wind up with, is a very brief focus on an alternative approach that is pretty broad, not detailed here. And we'll wind up there, focusing on an alternative that, however demanding, promises a life in stronger local communities, realigned in harmony with nature. And then I'll turn it over to Carol Van Houten, who will present the part on Iraq.
So briefly, as Dan mentioned, probably most of you are fully aware of this, that the key failures at the outset of the war, number one being that it was a totally unnecessary war of choice, and that the rationale for getting into the war was illegitimate, and finally that the way it was planned and executed was incompetently done. Let's see. Yeah. So despite Bush's effort to demonstrate when there was no link between Iraq and al-Qaeda, nor of course were there any weapons of mass destruction, and the policymakers were ignorant of Iraq's politics and history and culture, and the planning was grossly mismanaged. As you probably all know, we're approaching 4,000 troops killed in Iraq. As you also probably know, there are around 30,000 who are injured in combat. I recently saw an estimate that there's an additional about the same number of people who were killed in non-combat but connected to being in Iraq, but that the Pentagon's keeping that number pretty secret. The estimates on post-traumatic stress disorder, even the military admits 1 in 4 at this point. I think we know it for sure will be at least 1 in 3, as it was with Vietnam, and probably much higher. The costs are enormous. As Stan mentioned this morning, the data that Bob Wing presented last night about the costs of the war are escalating, and these are probably underestimates. A big issue about this is charged to our children and grandchildren's credit cards. So it's not just the cost now, it's the cost that we'll be enduring for future generations. The occupation, as I'm sure you're all aware, has led to an increase in insurgency, and our presence in Iraq has become a magnet for insurgents and al-Qaeda recruits from abroad. This chart shows the decline in favorable opinions toward the U.S. Particularly notice Germany, Indonesia, and Turkey as examples, but pretty much all countries. And this, of course, is now only 2006 data. It's undoubtedly continued to decline drastically since then. Our practices of torture have contributed to the decline of opinion about America. Our kidnapping and rendition of terrorists for torture, secret torture sites around the world have only undermined any positive opinion toward the U.S. Want to focus also on the costs to the Iraqis. Here is a picture of just one little picture of the horrible impact on the Iraqis, which is incalculable at this point, the extent of it. Lancet report estimates that there are around 655,000 Iraqi deaths. That's a couple of years old now, so that seems unlikely to be very low. It seems likely to be very low. This is a map. Many of you probably heard about the issue of refugees from Iraq. This is a little chart that shows about the 4,000 who have left Iraq to the neighboring countries, which, of course, the situation of the people who have left in those neighboring countries is pretty dire. Many of them it's so bad that some of them are even returning to Iraq at this point. In addition, there are at least 2 million internally displaced, and with internal displacement comes lack of access to food because one has to get food from the locality in which one is registered as living. So what's the present situation? As I said, this charts the drastically lowering opinion of George Bush by the U.S. public. It's plummeted, with the vast majority now opposed to occupation in Iraq. Is that clear? Many in the U.S. are worried that if we leave soon, that the chaos would be worse. There's been deadly, as we all know, there's been sectarian strife. But it's important to also realize that some of this is politically motivated. There's a stalemate between Iraqis who prefer a strong central government and those who prefer regional governments. Separatists supporting strong regional sect-dominated governments and represent the majority on the Council of Ministers, which is more like our executive branch and is headed by al-Maliki. And there are both separatists and nationalists within each of the religious sects within Iraq. So that is an underreported cause of the strife in Iraq. Well, we have been giving lip service to supporting a strong national government. The reality is that we have backed the weak national government, which would be far more conducive to oil corporations getting control. This is a map, kind of overwhelming, of the bases that we have in Iraq. And of course, you're all aware that one of the big issues is, will we remain there permanently, or 100 years, as McCain would say, or are we getting out? So this map represents some representation of the potential 14 permanent bases in Iraq. You'll notice that they tend to be where the oil is. So what can be done about Iraq? And we've come to think that the only solution is the withdrawal of all U.S. troops, the closure of all U.S. bases, and support for stabilization through such organizations as the United Nations, the regional states, and the European Union. Because in our opinion, the U.S. government is too tainted to play a significant role among the Iraqis. So we need to commit to removal of all our forces. And that we, if you remember, the Iraq Study Group, the bipartisan group in 2006, recommended that the U.S. should ask the UN and regional states, and including, of course, Iran and Syria, to help stabilize and mediate the conflict. They have intense interests, of course, in stabilizing things to avoid further conflict within the region. And recent studies of Iraqi opinion indicate strong support for the U.S. getting out and for a strong national government that takes control of the oil resources, and a belief that the Iraqis themselves could take care of al-Qaeda if we were out. So the U.S., lessons from the war, the U.S. is asserting our superpower status. We've claimed our right to attack countries unilaterally if we determine it's in, or if somebody determines it's in our security interest. And much of the world is reacting very negatively and denying support to us. The Islamic populations in the U.S. Are involved in the U.S. has generated significant insurgencies, including stepped up international recruitment by extremely violent movements by our actions. This is a map of the region. And of course, while from time to time there's talk about an attack on another Islamic country, Iran, and the consequences of attacking Iran seem about as dubious as they were in attacking Iraq. It's unlikely we could have quote-unquote military success. It would most likely increase regional conflict. And our troops that are in Iraq would be under more attack, and oil prices would surge even more than they have recently because of the oil needing to pass through the Straits of Hormuz. Could be easily disrupted. And it seems like for sure it would only expand the growth of insurgent violent movements. And so we're at this point unclear what the president intends to do about Iran, which is of great concern. And I'll turn it back to Dan.
So what we want to summarize right here is what we think the lessons are from Iraq and the global war on terror, treating those together. It's our position, it's not just our position, that terrorist acts are better treated as criminal acts with political implications rather than as an act of war. And an effective response requires international cooperation of people and governments. I parenthetically note, think of Pakistan at this moment and for the past few years. And can you deal with extreme violence if you're dealing just with governments? And do you not need people at the base to care about what you think you care about and work together? And if you don't have that cooperation, forget it. The U.S. reliance on a unilateral military response is so extremely costly, the Iraq War being on credit, that it's unsustainable. I encourage you to pick up on the dry-looking newspaper articles that you may see these days on the estimate of the costs of the Iraq War by Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel economist who has been making estimates of the cost that are now at the level of $3 trillion. That's hard to deal with, what $3 trillion means. But the point is it's a huge amount and on credit. And so the call for anteing up on the costs just haven't come down to us. That's for the kids to deal with and the grandkids, if the system holds together that long. And you can't sustain that. It diverts our attention, perhaps this is the most important, it diverts our attention from the more pressing matters. And it has the effect of giving our executive branch almost unlimited power in the name of national security. To make the larger military point, we use this slide that looks at CENTCOM for Central Asia, Middle East and Central Asia, and U.S. bases in this region. So consider it. It stands for the U.S. Central Command. It's one of 6 regional unified commands which has been developed over the decades, and it's been a bipartisan policy, proved bipartisanly, to establish what the military now calls full spectrum dominance. I have to look at my notes carefully because that doesn't trip off my tongue. But that means being able to handle any threat in the military view, anywhere on the globe. But here in this key area, maintaining control over oil resources in the Middle East has obviously been crucial. It should be noted that this map represents the pre-Iraq invasion, and so there are more bases and more commitments all the time. Imagine the cost in troops and dollars, and I would say politically, of a primarily military strategy to attempt to maintain control in this region. That is, you'd need to protect bases. You need to protect ports, oil pipelines. Think what Iraqi guerrillas have been able to do with regard to pipelines in Iraq, and we're talking about a much vaster region. And this is against movements seeking greater local control, and that are increasingly, in this situation, anti-U.S. And the worst thing of all is it diverts our attention from the big picture. And Bruce is going to talk about that big picture.
Okay, can you hear me all right at this distance? Up? Like this? Okay. Well, I get to do this section. It's because it's been sort of my baby for the last 2 or 3 years. Progressive Responses was formed in response to 9/11, and that's hence the name Progressive Response to 9/11, as opposed to the response that the Bush administration represents. And of course, initially, it had to do with the build-up to the Iraq War, and our focus was almost exclusively on the Iraq War itself and trying to raise consciousness about how our policy of unilateral intervention in other countries was bound to fail. And whenever the question of oil was brought up, it was so quickly spoofed by Cheney et al. Oh, it's so you can't believe that we're over there to get Iraq's oil. I mean, how crazy is that? Yet the line of reasoning up to this point in our presentation is leading really to what we feel now is actually the main point of our occupation in Iraq, which is oil. And so this part of the presentation is intended to go into a little bit more detail about why, at this juncture in history, it has become so important for the United States to keep track of where the oil is and to make sure it stays in control of it. So please be patient and raise your hand if you want me to go back a slide or want me to slow down a little bit. There's going to be a few graphs and so on. Hopefully it'll be fairly simple. This graph here, some of these are dated because I pulled these off the internet, but it's basically to give you the overall sort of big picture of what's been going on historically over the last decades. And so these are good enough, I think. This in 2001 was how the global consumption of oil played out. And it suggests that by comparison to the rest of the world, Americans here, including the Canadians, consume on a per capita basis roughly 2 times as much oil as the Europeans and other industrialized nations, and about 10 times as much as the rest of the world. So it gives you a picture of just how we stand in that regard. As can be seen on this graph, China and India, which, yeah, it's pretty visible down here, are intent on catching up. So China, the red, and India, the yellow, are on this up curve. We're kind of at a steady rate here. But as also can be seen, they have a long ways to go, especially when you consider that both China and India each have about 4 times the population of the United States. The fact of the matter is that the planet is unable to sustain such a development using conventional oil resources. The reason for this is contained in the notion of peak oil. And let me explain. As this graph shows, the U.S. domestic oil production peaked at about 1970. And while we began importing oil shortly after the war, you can see here 1950 was about when we started. It's now reaching a critical proportion. After 1970, the amount of imported oil increased dramatically. In other words, we have been and will continue to be increasingly reliant on imported oil to meet our huge and increasing consumption habits. And I believe it's now at about 2/3 of our consumption is from imported oil. So So the graph that I showed you earlier on the U.S. consumption, you know how it kind of went up, and then in 1970 it started going down in terms of what we were able to produce for ourselves. This is the graph on the global level, and it may appear familiar to some of you because it's related to the notion of peak oil. And the peak being right a little bit to the right of that line. Some people feel now that we're already entering that period of peak oil, and certainly the price of oil has been going up despite, you know, all these protestations that, well, we have plenty of oil on inventory. Well, how is it that the price of oil continues to go up if we have plenty on inventory? Can it be that people are figuring out that there's not a whole lot of oil behind that inventory, and that's why there is an inventory? So this graph tells us that the world as a whole is now entering a new era of oil scarcity. Unless another energy strategy based on sustainable sources is created and gains acceptance, the situation promises extreme global competition and conflict. Now, the second thing, which I won't dwell on in as much, but the second issue that's closely related is the greenhouse effect, global warming, climate change, however we want to call it. And that's a huge complicating factor. The scientific community has convincingly established that fossil fuel burning has contributed dramatically to the increase of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that has in turn led to its warming. One trend caused by global warming has been the dramatically increased melting of glaciers everywhere. And this is something that was not that well known when we first formed this PowerPoint. Now it's, I think, pretty widely known because there's been a lot about it in the news, and it's been accelerating. This photo series dramatizes the shrinking that has been occurring over the last century to a glacier that previously had remained virtually unchanged for centuries. Grinnell Glacier in Glacier National Park. But this is true all over the world, and a lot of focus recently has been on glaciers in both the North Pole area and in Antarctica, where they are noticing that it's not just melt off the top, it's been melting from underneath. The warmer water from the ocean is melting underneath and actually creating a kind of a skid effect whereby glaciers that are on land are moving faster across the land into the water, which, of course, as we all know, automatically then will increase sea level. And low-lying areas then will become more and more likely to be flooded. Skeeter raises a very important point regarding the melting of the glaciers, and that has to do with the glaciers that are on mountains in particular, because the melting of those glaciers on a seasonal basis represents the fresh water that the low-lying lands receive every season. And as those glaciers melt, more and more, they'll reach a point where they just won't be the glaciers, or they'll be so small as to not produce what dwindling amount of fresh water will be occurring on the lowlands. And so this then will, of course, lead to civil conflict as people are scrambling for the remaining resources. I think now, this is also true with respect to the effect on the weather, the actual climate, we call it climate change, such that areas that used to have rain have less rain. And some people argue that one major factor in the conflict in Darfur has to do with the fact that at one point there was the nomadic tribes and the agricultural tribes were able to live in concert because there was enough rain for the nomadic tribes to also be on the same land, and that is no longer the case. And so that climactic factor is contributing to the conflict between the two different lifestyles. This, in general, global warming threatens unprecedented catastrophes both in terms of weather events and of climate changes. Here we show the decreasing size of summer ice in the Arctic Sea, and note the particularly dramatic drop for 2005, and recent studies actually show that the drop for 2007 has been even more dramatic. Other consequences of global warming include diminished annual water supplies, which I just talked about. This is most immediately significant in such populous sites as India and China, but it's forecast actually for the Oregon Cascades as well. Second, the inundation of sea onto coastal areas, most immediately affecting island nations and low-lying countries like Bangladesh. And 3, increased acidity of the ocean due to abnormally high levels of absorbed carbon dioxide, resulting in the dying off of nutrient-rich barrier reefs. Thus, the window to act effectively to avert catastrophic climate change is at hand. The challenge is so imminent and of such scope that the coordinated global action led by the greatest per capita contributor of greenhouse gases, the United States, must take place immediately. Faced with the dual threats of peak oil and global warming, the world can no longer entertain the delusion that the U.S. standard of living is possible for the entire planet. Indeed, the effort to attain such a goal will simply speed up our self-destruction. We must make a choice between a future filled with endless wars over declining resources in the context of intensifying global warming chaos, or a future in which people and governments come together to work out a positive alternative. I will end here and pass it on to Dan. The old credo, still supported by our political leadership, is that only by, quote, growing the economy can we solve our problems. And developing countries such as China and India are vigorously following that lead. But these are the very strategies that have led to the crisis. What's a poor citizen to do? Here's our sketch, as Dan will present, from local to global.
So what we're trying to do here is to lay out very broadly an alternative that ties in a lot of major dimensions. And this is not in detail, as you will soon see. It couldn't be at this point. We need to reduce the scale of human economic activity toward localization to cut energy use and shift to a conservation and benign renewable base. A lot of political power is going to be needed locally and regionally to do this democratically and effectively. And in this transition, we'll need the support and enriched quality of life that strengthened communities provide. That comment is our effort to suggest that one of the crucial factors in making the transition is inspiration. If people are scared to death, they probably can be in denial to the end. And how to deal with that's a profound psychological and social psychological problem. But inspiration has a lot to do with it. Can life be good? Can life be better as we engage real problems? There's, of course, a crucial role for national governments. I mean, Bruce talks about the pickup of the impact of peak oil and global warming. The summary on that one is the recent scientific reports that show the increase in the rapidity and scope of the interaction of these factors. Richard Heinberg talks about that. Richard Heinberg, who gave a wonderful presentation here a couple of years ago, a student of peak oil and global warming. It'll be necessary for existing national governments to facilitate this complex shift as rapidly and in as orderly, fair, and effective a manner as possible. And we obviously also need international mechanisms for the coordinated conservation and sharing of remaining resources, or we'll have endless war. So what's the alternative direction? Here's our suggested steps. See what you think, and we'll have time to consider your ideas on that. Environmentally, economically, and for general security, we need a shift to conservation and benign renewable energy resources. You look at the federal budget and it's overwhelmingly for the military, and obviously there has to be a tremendous shift here, and that is barely being discussed in the crucial year of 2008. We don't say here in writing, we do say here orally that we can't allow any politician to make any statement that overlooks this. We have to hold her and him to account on this transition in this year. This graph is our effort to represent our huge reliance on oil simply to bring food to the table. That can change. That must change. What this shows is how many times further mass-produced vegetables must travel to get to our table than locally produced ones in energy terms. So what we need to do is shift our food system from relying on the energy-intensive, huge corporate food system to a combination of farmers markets and the like, which many of us, but not all of us by any means in this area, are familiar with. So we need these national policy changes, shifting research and incentives toward conservation, much higher conservation standards in transportation, for example, and also focusing on the shift, the facilitating of the shift to local food production and away from heavily concentrated, environmentally damaging conventional agriculture. There's good work going on at the state level and the local level, particularly on the West Coast, but all over the country. It's just not enough, and it's not moving fast enough. That's an indicator of CSAs, of consumer-supported agricultural arrangements, which you can see here easily by going to the Saturday market or just even reading the Weekly and even the Register Guard on CSAs. This represents Oregon Tilth, an important certifier of organics that's been around quite a while and is increasingly important. But the problem is we have to be dealing with these things at all of the levels that are relevant, from the local to the international. And so we refer to international arrangements such as represented at Kyoto, and in the interest of time and maximizing the time left for comments from you, I won't go in here to what's involved in Kyoto. Everybody here is aware that the United States is the only holdout now. Australia's elected a decent government, and here we are. And we may too, but we have lost precious time. So the upshot is that we need enormous amount of expansion and intensification of citizens' movements. There's just no other way to make the shift and hold politicians to account. We need them. We need international institutions for fair access to declining resources and the shift to sustainable energy and the control of greenhouse gases. And that means we've got to have a stronger, more effective arrangement for decision-making at the UN, greater development of international law and courts, and the establishment of an effective international peacekeeping body to enforce such laws. How can we imagine to do this? The political challenge is enormous. One positive impact of the Iraq War is that there has come to be a substantial U.S. public reconsideration of the resort to military solutions. And you find it in public opinion survey after public opinion survey, that there has been a big shift from the, what did Bush say on the aircraft carrier? Mission accomplished, from the days of mission accomplished to the present. There's growing very widespread evidence, and we'll have some citations of this evidence on our handout at the end in case you want access, but I think widely available evidence of public opinion and foreign policy expert opinion in support of multilateralism, diplomacy, shifting to renewable energy, and aggressive action on global warming. All of the major points that we've dealt with. But public action is needed to mobilize people with these perspectives until politicians begin to act accountably. All politicians, I think we would say. We reject the prospect of endless, draining, spirit-killing war. We think an approach based on effectiveness, fairness, strengthened communities, and a mode of life in harmony with nature is much more likely to elicit people's decency, their imagination, and their energetic commitment. The choice is much simpler than anything we feel that we've ever faced. Yep. And so what we want to conclude with is the simple challenge. Which of these contrasting futures do you want for yourself and your kids and your grandkids? And we'd like to see what you'd like to raise about our approach here, what your ideas are. So let's turn right now to that.